Dear God in heaven, we thank you for bringing us safely through another week. And we know that there are many that are struggling because of the consequences and happenings of their week. We pray for them today. We pray for those that can't be with us. Please bless them where they are and bless us here as we gather on this Zoom portal. We pray for clarity of thought and word, that we would have a greater understanding of external events and how they will affect us and how we will interact with the world because of them. So bless us now with your Holy Spirit and your presence. And we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thank you. Let's see. I'm going to bring up the screen. Actually, no, before I do that, let's do a quick review of the King of the North and the King of the South. Back in 2020, Elder Tess drew a picture of the world and she put the North Pole up there and the South Pole down here and explained how polar opposites work. That if you jumped out of a helicopter at the North Pole or you jumped out of the helicopter at the South Pole, you'd have a hard time differentiating between the two. You'd have to go searching for some animals. Soon you'd work out that there are no polar bears in Antarctica and there's no penguins in the Arctic. So there are similarities and differences. And when we take that to a prophetic understanding, we have to be able to see both. So 1989, the King of the North and the King of the South have been at war, and there's a deadly wound inflicted on the King of the South. The King of the North is the US. The King of the South is the USSR. And as we are studying China, what we are studying is the sphere of influences that each of these entities has. That the King of the North has a very strong sphere of influence, and so does the King of the South. And one of the greatest influences that the King of the South has had is on their neighbor, China. So we're looking at them as being heavily influenced by Russia. And even today, still very, very influenced by Russia, even though it's quite a lopsided relationship, as we'll see, that China is much more powerful economically, even some say militarily, it's very powerful. It's still heavily influenced by China and Russia. And we know that when we come back here to 1949 and the Chinese Revolution, how Mao Zedong obtained his communist ideology was through Stalin, through the communist revolution that was in Russia. So right from the very beginning here, we see the heavy influence that Russia has had on China and still continues. What we want to do is not review too much. This is our third study. And what I would like to jump in 2001. And there will be a little bit of review, but not the heavy review as last time. So 2001, and just let me bring up the board. So you might be able to see it a bit more clearly. 2001, what we noted was that China joined the World Trade Organization. And at last time, I was trying to find a quote that I had in my notes. And it's funny how you can highlight something and put it in bold and not see it. So as soon as I turned off the video, I found the quote I was after. So I want to share that with you now. And it's from Wikipedia. And it says this: President Bill Clinton in the year 2000 pushed Congress to approve the US-China trade agreement and China's accession to the World Trade Organization, saying that more trade with China would advance America's economic interests. Quoting Clinton, "Economically, this agreement is the equivalent of a one-way street." So we learn from Wikipedia, and there are other articles to say that Clinton heavily influenced Congress to accept China, a trade agreement with China, and to allow it to join the World Trade Organization. So let's put that in a bit of historical context. So after World War II, we've mentioned before, there was an initiative to boost countries' economies after World War II. So they wanted to boost economic recovery. And so they formed an organization called GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And China was one of its founding members. And then there was the 1949 Communist Revolution, and China was, the new communist government was not interested in these multi-level schemes across the world. It just became insular. So it no longer was a member of GATT. And they had their own economic policies through these years, which were a total failure. Many millions starved. The economy was in a ruin. Even though they had a cultural revolution over the 50s and 60s, it brought even worse economic conditions to the country. So Mao Zedong dies the early 1970s. We have a new government we have a new leader, but a new communist government in China. And there's diplomatic relations have started with the United States, and they begin these economic reforms. And the economic reforms are really successful. And China starts to improve. Here in 1979, it is a poor, backward country. After a few years of these economic reforms, things are really starting to turn around. And by the mid-80s, it's starting to become an export powerhouse. And there are countries, especially in the United States, that want to get into China. So, and China wants to get back into the GATT. And they start negotiating. And the way it works is you first have bilateral agreements with other countries, and then other countries that are members of GATT. And then with their approval, you can then join GATT. So you might start negotiations with all sorts of countries. And they started negotiating with America and others. And it was going swimmingly. Everything was fine until June 4, 1989, Tiananmen Square. And the world was horrified. We forget. But this is the time of the end, and we really need to remember Tiananmen Square. The world was horrified, and negotiations of them joining GATT were just totally off the table now, just dismissed. Don't even go there. Sanctions were put on China, some really hard sanctions. So this is a Bush administration. It put sanctions on China, and Congress were actually hoping that they would put even stronger sanctions on China. So yeah, just not going to happen because of Tiananmen Square. Then we come down, we looked at 1991, 1992, you've got an election in America and a new administration. Bill Clinton wins in 1992. Early 1993, the first year of office, early in the first year of office, let's have a look at what happens. I'll read. Washington. On the sunny morning of May 28, 1993, an unlikely assemblage of 40 Chinese dissidents, Chinese student leaders, and Tibetan activists was summoned to the Roosevelt Room of the White House to meet the top leaders of the new Clinton administration. As they looked on, President Clinton signed an order, it's an executive order, that for the first time required China to take steps towards easing political repression if it wanted renewal of its trade benefits in the United States. Starting today, says Clinton, the United States will speak with one voice on China policy, Clinton declared optimistically. It was, in its way, a remarkable moment. Some of the leaders of the democracy movement that had swept Chinese cities in 1989 were being given tangible support by the President of the United States. That event is now virtually expunged from the memory of the Clinton administration, and so is the China policy that went with it. So, early 1993, these 40 Chinese dissidents are called in, and Clinton gives this executive order. And what it does is it places 7 requirements on China that if they want to get back onto the table negotiating trade deals, they have to meet 7 requirements. And I'll just... Those requirements, they had to remove immigration restrictions. So what's that? They had to let their people leave the country if they wanted to. Okay, so they had immigration restrictions. You just couldn't leave. They had to comply with a US-China agreement on exports made with prison labor. So don't export stuff that is made by prisoners. They had to promise to adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They had to release and account for political prisoners. So don't just release them. We want to know where they are and that they're safe. They had to ensure humane treatment of prisoners. They had to protect Tibet's religious and cultural heritage. And they had to permit international radio and TV broadcasts into China. So 7 requirements. So early 1993, there's this executive order. And what this article will go on to say is that in early 1994, it's pulled down. It's no longer used. So Clinton actually says that it wasn't useful anymore in 12 months. So how did China react to this executive order? It did a lot of things. It wasn't impressed. It loaded chemicals for making weapons on a freighter to Iran. It shipped technology for missiles to Pakistan. And it rejected pleas from the Clinton administration to cancel long scheduled underground nuclear testing. So it was belligerent. It thumbed its nose at the United States. And after 12 months, only 12 months, of doing that, the Clinton administration backed down and said, we are now going to decouple, and we should be familiar with that word now, decouple human rights from trade deals, from the economy. And this article that we will just look at, it will go on to explain how that really just empowered authoritarian nations, especially in Southeast Asia, that the bad effect that it had. We're just looking for another article written in 1994, Baltimore Sun. President Clinton, unabashedly changing course, renewed China's favorable trade status yesterday and abandoned its use as a weapon for pressuring Beijing on human rights improvement. The president's decision directly contradicted a position staked out last year when he demanded overall significant progress in China's human rights record as a condition for renewing its most favoured nation's trade status, that's MFN. He acknowledged yesterday that despite some strides, serious human rights abuses continue in China. The president insisted that the United States could do more to encourage human rights progress by expanding trade and improving overall US-Chinese relations. Now, Congress wasn't happy, though. Well, I shouldn't say that. There were the ones that were happy were multinational companies that had been lobbying him to not do this, Republicans, and moderate Democrats. But there were other Democrats who were really angry about this, one of them being Nancy Pelosi, Representative Nancy Pelosi. Mr. Clinton was under heavy pressure by US companies to renew favored nation status with China, which allows lower tariffs for Chinese imports. They said that the potential damage to US interests from a trade war was highlighted, especially since China had agreed to a $5 billion deal to buy 50 aircraft from Boeing. So they're saying, don't do this. Don't worry about human rights. It'll take care of itself. Let's put the economy first, and then the rest will come. So negotiations began, and they continued. So China is going to try and get back into GATT for 15 years. I might add that in the mid-1990s, the GATT changed the World Trade Organization. So they disbanded GATT, swapped it for the WTO. Essentially the same thing, it's just more comprehensive. So it's going to try and join the World Trade Organization, but it needs to have a bilateral agreement with the United States first. And it manages to do that in the year 2000. These are high-level diplomatic talks going back and forth every year for 15 years, but especially since 1994. And a lot of political maneuvering in that time. Each year it had to go to Congress, and the United States Congress would have to go yes or no. So it was year 2000, Clinton's coming to the end of his term in office. He really wants to seal this deal, and they finally come to an agreement. He's able to take it to Congress. Congress agree in 2000, 2001, and they're in the world, China is in the World Trade Organization. And to this day, there are congressmen and congresswomen who do not sleep at night because of that decision. Why? Why are they doubting that they did the right thing? There's such a thing as China shock. So they were worried they were going to lose out to all these economic benefits by not making a deal with China. But the opposite was the truth. Opposite appeared to be true. So if you go to Wikipedia, and there's many books written on this, and you just look up China shock. China shock is the impact of rising Chinese exports on manufacturing employment in the United States and Europe after China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. Studies have estimated that the China trade shock reduced US manufacturing employment by between 0.55 million to 2.5 million. Losses in manufacturing employment have also been observed in Norway, Spain, and Germany. So what happens is that now these countries are being flooded with cheap Chinese exports, and manufacturing jobs are being lost in the United States. If we scroll down, political impact. Studies have linked the effects of the China shock to an increase in populism and a backlash against globalization. Studies have shown that British regions that were more exposed to China's Chinese import competition were more likely to vote for Brexit in the 2016 referendum. Exposure to the China shock has led to negative views of minorities, in particular among American whites and males. Papers have found that the China shock has contributed to political polarization. One analysis also found that it contributed to Donald Trump's victory in the 2016 presidential election. A counterfactual study of closely contested states suggests that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania would have elected the Democrat instead of the Republican candidate if, all things being equal, the growth in Chinese import penetration had been 50% lower than the actual growth during the period of analysis. The Democrat candidate would also have obtained a majority in the Electoral College in this counterfeit scenario. And then explains what happened in also in Italy and others. The social impact. So these are studies, there's actually quite a group of studies that have been done. One in particular was 3 MIT economists, and it's well respected, that have been looked at a large body of data, and it's been, it's a well-received study. A 2016 study found that exposure to Chinese import competition led to greater high school graduation rates in the United States. This is possibly because of lower wages and employment opportunities for individuals without high school degrees in regions that competed with China. Economist Samuel Hammond has argued that the signing into the law of the PNTR, Permanent Normal Trade Relations, so that's the 2000 agreement with the United States, and the subsequent accession of China to the WTO has had wide-reaching social implications. He states that the PNTR has been implicated in some of the most significant and distressing trends of American life in this century. Millions of well-paying manufacturing jobs lost, declining family formation and rising deaths of despair, suicide, soaring real estate prices and medieval levels of urban inequality, increased political polarization and populist movements, left and right, and faltering faith in the power of liberal democracy to respond to these and related challenges. To pin all of this on a single trade agreement would be a step too far, of course, and yet the imprint of what's come to be known as the China shock can be seen on all these trends, either through its first-order effects or its reverberations through the body politic. It also notes that trade-related job losses contributed to greater military enlistment in the United States. So, as I said, much has been written on this, on the consequences of China being brought into the World Trade Organization. Here's a Vox article, another kick in the teeth, a top economist on how trade with China helped elect Trump. And so I won't, he's one of those economists I was talking about. Essentially, his work is written up in the Wikipedia article. But if you can take your mind back to the 2016 election, this is what Trump was taking to the Rust Belt of America. China, China, China. They've taken away your jobs. They've taken away their jobs. And he was right. So he was right, but his solution to the problem was wrong. So we can see a link between 1989, Tiananmen Square, time of the end, where that was empowered in 2001 with China's joining the WTO, and we can take that down to 2016 and Trump's election, and I might add continuing on to 2024 when Trump is still a player in the next election. So China joining the WTO is a major turning point, not only for China and the United States, but for the world. So any questions or thought on that as we reviewed the WTO? Is that clear?
Elder Terrie.
Brendan.
That decoupling from trade to human rights, isn't that almost identically to what Germany and others did with Russia in 2014? In a similar way that and so they built the pipeline and accelerated trade, and they thought, oh, your human rights violations we'll be able to work on that over time, and it just got worse and worse. And that's what's happened in China as well.
Because the thinking is that integrate China into global economy will make them more like us. And Ian Bremmer, in one of his latest videos, said, we just want to make them like Americans, and then the whole world would be improved. And it just doesn't work like that way. Not looking at China from their perspective, how they see the world, their ideology. So, to take human rights off the table was a really bad mistake, because not only we did these journalists see a connection between 1994 and Clinton taking it off the table and the empowering of authoritarian governments in the Pacific region. But from 2000 onwards, we're going to see China not only continue, but really ramp up their human rights violations. It doesn't mean anything. It's just rhetoric. There's no teeth in the sanctions that do occur. If we come forward, so we're 2023, and we are all familiar with the Magnitsky Act, which is a United States law that imposes sanctions on certain individuals that, corrupt, started off with corrupt Russians for their abuses of human rights. Well, now there is a global Magnitsky Act, and the last time I looked, I counted 7 Chinese officials. 5 of them were related to Hong Kong. 3 of them, only 3 from Xinjiang province, and the persecution of the Uyghurs. So I'm hoping that you've taken the time. If you haven't, please take the time to research the Uyghur community and what is happening there. Because we noted that in 2001, and I don't want to repeat it, but now with the bombing of the World Trade Center, China has the impetus. It's been the catalyst for it to impose its strict state terrorism on its own people. And if you can get a grasp of the vastness, the numbers involved in this, and to think there's only 5 officials that have sanctions on them, that's actually 3. Only 3 officials that have sanctions on them for the abuses in that area. It's just mind-boggling. 7 with Hong Kong. So yes, it's very, very. We would expect to see the similarities between Russia and China. So Magnitsky Act, Russia, also China, but to a lesser degree. There just hasn't been the push. Catherine?
The China shock, that's linked to the human rights abuses. Is that right? Is the idea that because of the human rights abuses that is driving the cheap prices, which is why the impact on American and other countries' manufacturing was so big? In a scenario where China was not committing human rights abuses, if they joined the World Trade Organization, would the outcome have been less of a China shock? I'm just trying to,
Sure. So the
bring in
China
that.
shock is not linked to the human rights abuses. The
Okay.
China shock is simply the economic outfall of increasing Chinese exports into the country. Oh, they're able to do that because human rights have been taken out off the table. And they're also able to do that because they're probably using prisoners. We know that these internment camps, the Uyghur internment camps, that's connected with big multilateral companies. I think we talked at one stage about, and Elder Tess talked about, when they discovered that a lot of the cotton was coming from the Xinjiang province and was used in dressmaking in the fashion industry. So it's able to exploit China is able to exploit human rights to export more, but it's even without that, the opening up to all that trade didn't have the benefits that the countries weren't prepared for it. They weren't prepared for the vast amount of exports that would come. And the thing is, it didn't play by the rules. It never plays by the rules. It either bends them or ignores them. There were tariffs that it didn't drop, and it devalued its own currency. There were things that China did during this period that it just didn't play by the rules of the WTO.
Yes. Yes, so being an authoritarian government is part of the equation as well, because there's nothing wrong with trading with other countries per se. You know, it's not a principle of like they shouldn't have opened up trade with other countries, because that would be, almost a racist thing to do. But the issue is with the authoritarianism and the human rights things which all contributed to the way they were manipulating the currencies and the cheap labour that they were able to exploit, and all of those other things contributed then to the rise of this movement in America with Donald Trump, leading to Donald Trump. Is that, am I understanding kind of? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So it's all threaded together.
Yeah.
We know that human rights are an issue because it's 1989.
Yes.
They had to take the negotiations off the table because of that event. That's how Clinton opened his administration dealing with these issues, but it just got shut down really quickly. The lobbying from big businesses and the backlash from Republicans and members of his own party, that just they wanted a slice of that pie.
Yes, that's
and
right.
It wasn't like it was at any cost. Sorry?
Oh, it reminds me of that issue with Flint, Michigan, and the whole scenario as well. It all aligns with what you're saying, so it makes sense. Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, so China's shock it's complex, but it is blamed for essentially Donald Trump. He was able to use it to gain election, and yeah, a lot of people have suffered. So yeah,
Terrie,
no. Sure.
Oh, sorry. Just with the sanctions that you were talking about on those Chinese, who was doing the sanctioning? Is it in the US or?
Yeah, the US put sanctions on So, you know, there were trade sanctions and just trying to think what other sanctions. They were all trade-related sanctions.
Terrie, please. Do you think that if they understood the Chinese culture, what made the country, they would have prevented a lot of that, or?
So this is what keeps these congressmen and congresswomen up at night. It's like, what if? What if? What if we didn't let them in? Or what if we just waited? You know, we waited 13, they waited 15 years. What if they waited another 15? And I might add, China was prepared to wait another 15. And in the year 2000, especially after there was an embassy bombed, one of their embassies were bombed by the United States. It was a big whoopsie. They thought the CIA had the right building, but they had the wrong tenants. And 3 Chinese officials died. You know, China was prepared to wait another 15 years unless it had its conditions. These were not easy trade negotiations. So there's a lot of what ifs, and they're still talking about it today. What if? So we know all we can go on is the what. And the what is that down now here we have mass detention of a minority group that might be a minority in China, but it's not a minority when we consider the numbers of Uyghurs that they are. And this has impacted the world. There is a Chinese diaspora. So there are many Uyghur people in this country. They're in Melbourne, they're in Adelaide, and they can't speak. They're in a cage just as their relatives are in detention, because the surveillance, the long arm of China reaches into the countries around the world. And if they speak up, if they complain, then their relatives are locked up even for longer, or goodness knows what would happen to them. You've got people here that women trying to contact their families, can't contact them. And then there might be a Chinese official that says, I'll make it happen. So the Chinese official will be able to allow this contact between somebody in another country and their relatives back in Xinjiang. They can't talk about anything of great importance, you know, they talk about the weather, but at least you hear their voice. And then the Chinese official who sits in on all the conversations will say, now don't you talk, don't you complain, you'll never talk to them again. And then the next time the Chinese official might say, send me some naked photos. And the next time you might get 3, 4 Chinese officials on your back saying, send. And you've got a choice. You either cut off contact with all of them and never speak to your family again, or you comply. This is happening to people that don't even live in China. They're in different countries of the world, refugees, different countries of the world, with citizenship that guarantees them human rights, and they don't have them even in other countries. So the human rights is not just about what's happening in China, it's how they're affecting the rest of the world. We could talk for hours about the Uyghurs. I really would like you to look up that yourself and understand it. I think it's worth each person understanding it to some extent, the vastness of the problem. Molly?
Yeah, I think Pelosi saw it in the right way, that they have to deal with the human rights. Yeah, that she got mad that the party went against that. They rather choose the economy first than human rights. Yeah.
So it's not just the Uyghurs, there's the Tibetans, there's the Hong Kong, there's Taiwan, there's a whole issue. There's a reason why Nancy Pelosi, one of her last official business was to visit Taiwan. And we'll get to that at some stage, but the human rights abuses are far-reaching. Okay, so that's a review of 2001. We see that they now say that there's a war on, they now refer to their Uyghur minorities as terrorists because of their Islamism. And then we moved on to 2004. Oh, yes, there was a treaty. You remember that long name? The Treaty of Good Neighbourliness and Friendly Cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation in 2001 as well. Oh, actually, I might note here too, we can note LGBTQ plus here, because for the first time, see if I've got that. And that's not coming up, but for the first time, psychiatrists in China now say that it's not a mental disease. So something that other countries have done decades ago, China is now going to say that it is not a mental disease. It's not an abnormality. They do say that it can be an abnormality if you are LGBTQ and you're not happy about it, but yeah, we'll talk more about that in later years, but we can note that there. Okay, so 2004 was the final agreement to end the border conflicts. We saw war back here in 1969 over borders between Russia and China. That's totally resolved in 2004. That was no small matter. Those wars back here almost led to nuclear war. So anyway, that's resolved in 2004. 2009, there is a riot in Urumqi in Xinjiang province, and that is going to put the Uyghurs again on the map and on the radar of the Chinese government to crack down on them even more. In 2012, we now have a new US administration. It is Barack Obama is the president, and under Hillary Clinton, they are going to institute a new policy called Pivot to East Asia. And this is done in 2012. And they want to put more resources into the East Asia region with China in mind. And we might come back to that another stage. There are joint naval exercises between the, I should share screen the board, shouldn't I? Joint naval exercises between the Russians and the Chinese for the first time. And in 2012, we are going to mark the rise of Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping is elected to the, he is, if you look over here, he is now president of the People's Republic of China. He is General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and he is chairman of the, well, he's chairman of the CMC. CMC is like the defense forces that oversee the army, or PLA. So he is president, he is general secretary, he is chairman. He is now more powerful than Mao Zedong ever was. He is, what do they call him? Paramount leader, paramount leader. So I just want to talk a little bit about Xi Jinping, because we talked about Confucianism, and it was there are 6 philosophies that are pretty much Chinese rooted, and but some of them are more popular and have more of an influence than others. So Confucianism, it's the one that we all know about, the one we're more familiar with. And if you remember, Confucianism says that everybody is innately good. It's just that everybody needs to find their role. So very, very patriarchal, that, you know, whether it's father and son or parents and child, husband and wife, leaders and populace, people need to know their role and keep to their role in society. And then you'll have peace and prosperity. So everybody's good, just know your place. Even within friends, there should be one that is the leader and one that is submissive, and then they'll get along fine. So to Chinese thinking, you know, Russia, Ukraine, Russia should be the dominant country. Ukraine should be, it's submissive. Same with mainland China and Taiwan. That's how things get along. So that's Confucianism. Xi Jinping isn't a hold to Confucius philosophy. He is a legalist. So Confucius lived around between 400 and 500 BC. Another philosopher lived between 200 and 300 BC. And he was, I'll bring him up. Whoops, nearly ended the meeting. Here is a picture of him. Not Sun Tzu or Confucius. Xi Jinping and elite Chinese politicians are reading this philosopher. So I've chosen this article because I just want to show you a picture of him. It's a portrait of Han Fei. In the past weeks, visuals of police and health workers in Shanghai forcing themselves into people's homes and spraying massive quantities of disinfectant captured headlines worldwide. But what justifies China's authority over people's personal space under Xi Jinping? Han Fei, an ancient Chinese political philosopher, may have some answers to offer. So we talked about Confucius. There's another philosopher called Sun Tzu. They're the most popular, but there is this Han Fei. And what Han Fei taught was opposite to Confucius, in that Confucius said everybody is innately good. Han Fei said everybody is innately bad. And so to have peace and prosperity, you have to have strict laws. The books that leaders read impact their governance style, leaving a long shadow. And Xi Jinping regularly quotes from Han Fei. He actually, when he was inaugurated in 2012, he quoted from Han Fei. Just trying to find. Han Fei believes that human beings are selfish. Hence, conflict cannot be eliminated. Only if a state is strong can it uphold state interests. So we'll stop there. So basically, everybody's bad. You have to be a legalist. You have to have laws and you have to enforce them. The state has to enforce them. And Xi Jinping is going to bring that philosophy into Chinese governance that hadn't really been seen up to date. So this is 2012. And things are going to really start changing for China as far as their laws and their surveillance goes. Oh, I didn't talk about that. Oh, well. Okay. Oh, yes. 2001, China gays are no longer mentally ill. We talked about that. So legalism in ancient China was a philosophical belief that human beings are more inclined to do wrong than right because they are motivated entirely by self-interest and require strict laws to control their impulses. And this is what we will see take hold of the Communist Party. So just a few statistics, we'll talk about this another time, but just to give an idea, expenditure on public security between 2012 and 2021 was 1.38 trillion yuan, or 296 billion Australian dollars. 296 billion Australian dollars was spent from 2012 onwards. That's a threefold increase in the past decade. So their public security, it consists of the police, state security, domestic surveillance, armed civil militia. They all deal with public disturbances. So they spend a lot of money on those 4 areas of public security. In 2018, China spent the equivalent of US $20 billion purchasing closed circuit television cameras and other surveillance equipment. You see, everybody's innately bad. We have to watch them so that we know what laws that we can enforce on them. In 2023, there are 540 million CCTV cameras. That's more than 1 camera per 3 people. They use facial recognition and emotion recognition to predict problem behavior. So just to note that this all comes from this philosophy of legalism. Any thoughts or questions? We're going to see human rights abuses now really ramp up. Okay then. So Xi Jinping is now in the picture, and we come to 2014. So 2014 is going to mark another major turning point. We have discussed the Kunming attack. Okay, the Kunming attack has been described as China's 9/11. So a group of 8 knife-wielding terrorists attacked passengers in the Kunming railway station. The attackers pulled out long-bladed knives and stabbed and slashed passengers at random. The assailants killed 31 civilians and injured more than 140 people. So this now is another catalyst for the Chinese officials to enforce the strong arm of the law. It has been described as China's 9/11, not because of how many were killed, thousands more in the US in 2001, but because of how it impacted the psyche of the Han population outside Xinjiang. So this attack was not in Xinjiang province, it was in one of the southern provinces. And now there's this fear put into the Han, which is the majority ethnic group of the Chinese. They were used to hearing about conflict and unrest over there, somewhere else, on the borders of China somewhere, but not outside that region. And also because of the brutality, machetes and swords, it was shockingly brutal. So this is another turning point. So couple of other things to note in 2014 was this $400 billion gas deal with Russia. And in 2014, China now becomes Russia's largest trading partner. So they're developing stronger commercial ties with each other. So we can mark the Uyghurs here with the Kunming attack, and now we're going to see an increase in a crackdown on that minority group, even though it was just done by a few extremists nowhere near Xinjiang province. We see the gas deal. We're not going to talk much about this. We'll come back to this at another time, the Hong Kong side of it, the Hong Kong umbrella revolution. So there is protests in Hong Kong, and it's called the umbrella revolution because they all put up their umbrellas to stop the tear gas getting in their faces. There are talks between, and I should, might help. There are talks between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, so between China and Taiwan. And this is the first time that Taiwanese officials have set foot on the mainland since 1949. So it's sort of kind of a major event, but it really was just a propaganda exercise by China and nothing really came of it. People were just concerned where it was going to head, but we do note that there. The other thing we want to note in 2014 is the hacking. So there's a huge hack attack that occurs in the United States in 2014. So I'm going to take this from a Wired article. If China hacked Marriott, 2014 marked a full-on assault. So Marriott, if you've heard of Marriott, it's a chain of hotels, large chain of hotels. It got hacked in 2014. They didn't know about it until 2018. This is actually a 2018 article. So information about these hacks started to drip out slowly over 2017, 2018. It increasingly appears that China was behind the Marriott hack, making 2014 a landmark year in cyber attacks against the US. The massive data breach that affected 500 million Marriott customers feels like a recent event, given that the company just discovered and disclosed it over the past 4 years. But it's important to remember that the attack began much earlier, especially as Reuters and others have reported that state-sponsored Chinese hackers were behind it. If that attribution holds up, and it has now, China's broader hacking campaign against the US in 2014 will go down as an historic assault. China's role in the Marriott hack remains unconfirmed in 2018, but the accusation comes amid already heightened tensions between the United States and China over trade and intellectual property. Okay, so let's just drop down. So what did they hack? Throughout 2015, analysts noted the intelligence value to China of gathering, oh, sorry, I'll have to go back. If China did perpetrate the Marriott hack in 2014, though, that would make it just one of several devastating, roughly concurrent cyber attacks against the United States. That same year, Chinese actors pilfered extremely sensitive and expensive data on tens of millions of US citizens from the Office of Personnel Management. That assault appears to have begun during the first months of 2014, initially detected by the OPM in March of that year. And in February 2014, Chinese hackers allegedly breached Anthem Insurance, stealing the names, birth dates, addresses, social security numbers, and even income data of 80 million people. So there's 3 companies. There's the Marriott hotel chain. There is the Office of Personnel Management, which is government, and there's Anthem Insurance. Throughout 2015, analysts noted the intelligence value to China of gathering in-depth information on so many people from multiple sources. The diversity of data could allow Chinese espionage agents to check and cross-reference information and track individuals over time. And if you throw the Marriott data into the mix, which included passport numbers like the OPN trove, the espionage effort seems even more comprehensive. And this is a quote: "If I were a foreign intelligence service and wanted to get a complete picture about a specific group of people, These are exactly the targets I would select, says Crane Hassold, a senior director of threat research at a fishing defence firm. OPM contained comprehensive data on government employees. Anthem contained detailed personal information, and Marriott contained travel records. From a foreign intelligence perspective, it would be very useful. Taken all together, China's 2014 hacking spree could potentially have revealed data on virtually every adult in the US. So, big deal. 2014, massive cyber attack by the Chinese in the United States. Okay. So I might just, what time is it? Just stop there and talk. We're talking about 2014 as a turning point. So as Yambaki noted this morning, 2012 is when we mark Putin as a dictator. So, and that's a formalization. And we have, as we noted in the beginning, China is heavily influenced by Russia. So it's not that it looks up to Russia as big brother, right? That relationship has turned. China is now big brother in its eyes, but the influence is still there. So I want to take us back into a bit of history of Russia. And we're going to go back to the Russian Revolution and back to Lenin. And when Lenin was, when the Russian Revolution was successful and there was a new communist government, but Lenin was concerned. And one of the things he was concerned about was what he called Great Russian chauvinism. I'll write it here. Great Russian chauvinism. So, and we will go to Wikipedia. Great Russian chauvinism is a term defined by the early Soviet government officials, most notably Vladimir Lenin, to describe an ideology of the dominant exploiting classes of the nation holding a dominant or sovereign position in the state, declaring their nation as the superior nation. Lenin promoted an idea for the Bolshevik Party to defend the right of oppressed nations within the former Russian Empire to self-determination and equality, as well as the language rights movement of the newly formed republics. So what was Lenin saying? Lenin was saying that there should be equality within the nation, that there shouldn't be any part of the nation that should declare itself superior. He said we should be able to defend the rights of oppressed nations. Now, back then in that history, he was talking about Georgia, because there was a lot of, the larger part of Russia wanted to dominate and control Georgia. And Lenin's saying, no, we're all equal. We should defend their right to autonomy, even within our communist government. So why is it called great? Why did he call it Great Russian Chauvinism? Because it's a term that was used in Imperial Russia. So Russia, what we understand as Russia, was Great Russia. And then there was Little Russia. Who do you think Little Russia was? Any ideas? Great Russia, Little Russia. Who would you say Little Russia is? Yeah, Ukraine was Little Russia, right? So there's great and there's little. So this argument wasn't about Ukraine, though. This was an argument about Georgia. So Lenin says, no, we're not going to have that. Lenin dies. We get Stalin. Stalin believes in great Russian chauvinism. Now, chauvinism is an interesting word. It's the unreasonable belief in the superiority or dominance of one's own group or people who are seen as strong and virtuous, while others are considered weak, unworthy, or inferior. So we'd all be familiar with male chauvinism, the unreasonable belief in men's superiority or dominance over women's weakness, unworthiness, and inferiority. So it's an unreasonable belief. The etymology of the word is really interesting because it comes from the name of a French soldier whose name was Chauvin. And he was a French soldier under Napoleon, and he got wounded. And, you know, Napoleon lost that battle, and Napoleon ends up on an island, and then there's another government in place. But this wounded French soldier is still going to fight for the Napoleonic cause. And the name Chauvin became associated with anything that is irrational and fanatical. So when we think of chauvinism, it's irrational and it's fanatical. This wounded soldier refused to move with the times. He was going to keep fighting a losing battle. I think there's a really interesting analogy there. So Lenin didn't believe in the great Russian chauvinism. He fought against it. Stalin, he comes in, he's in power, and now he is going to, Russia will dominate all the satellite states. And then, of course, we talked about last time what happened in 1991. They lost their satellite states. So what China is putting in place is great China chauvinism. It's had the same influence because Mao Zedong, he's not a Leninist, he's a Stalinist. And so you combine this great China chauvinism with legalism, with the patriarchy of Confucianism, and that explains the Chinese government that you have today. So in 2014, we mark Russia's annexing of the Crimea. China would look at that and go, yeah, great Russia, little Russia. It's theirs. Big states should control and have superiority. They have a natural superiority over the little states. It was always, in fact, Putin blames Lenin for losing Crimea in the first place. So Lenin's not a popular figure amongst the Putin ideologists. But so yeah, 2014, China is definitely being influenced, whether it knows it or not, but it has that same thinking. This belongs to me. So therefore, Xinjiang province, whether it's Tibet, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Taiwan, they are the little that should be naturally dominated by the superior. So instead of great Russian chauvinism, it is great China chauvinism. And so today, when we talked about, the discussion came up in Yambaki's Q&A about sifting information. You've got reputable news services today that have articles about Xi Jinping's reaction to the Ukraine war and saying, oh, you know, friends forever. I bet Xi Jinping must be embarrassed now. He's not embarrassed. They're just watching. They're just, they might not be, they're clever people. They're not going to come outwardly out and back Putin, but they are very carefully doing that because they do believe in this great Russian chauvinism. And also, whatever happens in that war, it's a win-win for China. Ukraine wins, that is a country that needs rebuilding. Okay, and China's got a Belt and Road Initiative. They've got everything ready in place to be able to go in there and help Ukraine and do very well out of it. So it's win-win for China. It's not interested in external affairs. It's not, you know, it's not in that sense, in having to help Putin win the war. That's not in its best interests. But so when we read these articles, we have to sift. It's not that there are evil people writing these articles. It's just that what they have a tendency to do is put our Western ideas and perspective into understanding how another country is viewing things. And we can't do that. You have to understand how China thinks to understand why it's reacting the way or not reacting the way it does. To understand China is to understand Russia because it has the same influence, the same ideology. Doesn't think like Western governments. So any questions on that? Any thoughts? If you look up Great Russian Chauvinism Wikipedia, it says, from around 2014, the Putin regime in Russia embraced Great Russian Chauvinism. In July 2021, Putin published an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, in which he states that Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians should be in one all-Russian nation as part of the Russian world and are one people, whom forces that have always sought to undermine our unity wanted to divide and rule. NATO. Okay. So again, and this, they'll go into other speeches that Putin has made and things that he's written, but they mark 2014 as when Russia, Putin embraced Great Russian Chauvinism. And so we see that that will have and has had a great effect on China. And 2014 might be a good place to stop. We should be able to finish this next time around. So we'll close in prayer and we'll maybe have some questions. Our loving God in heaven, we thank you that we are learning how you operate and how you see people and how vast equality reaches across between all people. And we want to be a part of that kingdom. Where there is any superiority, any selfishness in our hearts, we pray that you would root it out. We know that the root of all of this chauvinism is patriarchy. Lord, we ask for greater understanding so that we can bring it home and we'll be able to explain it to others. So bless us now as we share the rest of the Sabbath with each other, and we think of the meetings that will occur this afternoon in Fiji. May you bless them also. And we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So we'll say goodbye to our Fijian members that need to go and have lunch, a late lunch. And is there any thoughts or questions?
Yes, I was just wondering, with the China shock, is it possibly reversible? Could the governments have said no more and wound that back?
So what was Trump going to do? It's going to bring manufacturing back. No, that horse is bolted. There's no going back to the way things are.
Yeah, he's unreliable, but I don't understand it. So I'm probably speaking ignorantly in that question. But yeah.
No, Marie. No, we've had a talk about that. No, that's a perfectly logical question. You know, can we fix it? I'm sure that's why
Mm.
these politicians are trying to undo things, but there's no going back. And our lines tell us that they've made these decisions,
true.
and then there's consequences, cause and effect.
Thank you.
Terrie, when you're talking about big Russia and little Russia and big China and little China having Taiwan, how does the Pacific Islands sit with all that as well? Is that something that China seems to have more input in?
So I guess they've never been a part of the Chinese history going back, whereas you've got borders with Tibet and these Central Asian countries, and we've talked a little about the history of Taiwan. They're Chinese people. But the influences in the Pacific Islands, not that they see them as Chinese, but it's all about trade and influence. Yes.
That's clear. Sorry, as soon as you started talking, that makes sense. Thank you.
So it's not about imperialism.
Terrie, please. We're talking about relationships here, Russia, Crimea, China, small China, Taiwan, all that. Male, female, male chauvinist, that. It seems like it doesn't matter where we look, we have this unbalanced, or shall I say imbalanced, relationships, and it comes all the way back to how you view each other as servant, master, gender.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's pervasive. That's what I'm trying to say. Throughout.
And so we will be talking more about women's rights next time, because it's lost my thought. We know what the root of the problem is. So someone once said, and I should remember who the someone is, and I can't, but someone once said, scratch any communist and you'll just find a nationalist. And this is what this is it's just core nationalism. If you want to see nationalism in the extreme, Russia, China. So if you're going to see nationalism, you're also going to see sexism, because that's the root of the problem as well. So I guess that's when we think of chauvinism, we automatically think of male chauvinism. Now we need to recognize that word is irrational and fanatical, and people have refused to move with the times, and it's a dying cause. So nationalism, sexism, you can't have one without the other. But the root problem we know is sexism. But yes, this is just hardcore nationalism. So when we think of Russia as we drew our world is state over church, and we think of the church as, well, the Eastern Orthodox, which is basically Christianity. So the state will use or weaponize the church for its own benefits. So with China, it's not about church so much as about philosophies. They will do the same with their philosophies. They'll weaponize them for their own benefits, but they are controlling them. So when you think of the North, it's church over state. So the church is trying to influence the government. So when it comes to issues of LGBTQ and women's rights, in the North, And in Russia, it's about morality. You know, it's just wrong. It's not in the Bible, or it's cursed in the Bible. So the difference between even the United States, Russia, and China is LGBTQ and feminism is about morality. Whereas in China, it's not about morality. It's got nothing to do with morality. It's about minorities. Because minorities are to be afraid of. Because minorities get influenced. So whether you're the Uyghurs in the West, the Islamic, so they've been influenced by Islamic extremism in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, etc. Or it's LGBTQ, who influences them?
The West.
The West. The West influence this minority group. Therefore, we need to crack down. And so you will see their WeChat groups shut down. We see them being suppressed, not because of morality, but because they're a minority. We need to control them. Can't let them talk in their little groups. Can't let them have access to Western contacts. All right, so it's similar but different. So they're using philosophy because LGBTQ are innately bad, so we need to have laws to control them, or they will disrupt our society. So next time, we'll look at domestic violence. Oh, that will be fun. You know, and how this has affected women. We've already partly looked at that through the one-child policy, but there's much more to it as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, Josephine, but we look at similarities and differences. So church over state, King of the North, state over church, King of the South, but it's not so much a church in China. It's philosophy. And yeah, so it's not about morality.
Thank you. Excellent.
Okay.
Elder Terrie, just flowing on from what you were just talking about there, with so you go to America and you've got your two political sides, and you know the left is big government, right is small government, and it's just interesting contrasting that to China, which is the King of the South's major ally. Well, they've also got a big government over there, so but it's for the purpose of attacking the minorities, whereas the big government on the left is trying to preserve equality. So big government doesn't necessarily mean good.
No, it's about control.
So
Control
it's
and
just
power.
interesting the different government models that all these players are adopting or have adopted, and how it sort of plays out on hurting people or helping people.
It's going to view Islam as an ideological virus. So if it's a virus, it needs to be stamped out, controlled. We need to actually there's an article I didn't share. This is from, let me just bring this up quickly. This is from Human Rights Watch. Break their lineage, break their roots. China's crimes against humanity, targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. So you just have to break everything off that gives them a unique identity, because they view anybody with a unique identity as a separatist. And separatists are dangerous. Separatists will break up our country, will bring chaos. Look what happened in 1991, right? So we have to break their lineage, have to turn them into one of us being Han. And yeah, so that they don't separate. And the problem is so many have already separated physically and are distributed across the world. So you have to be able to control them wherever they are, whatever country that they're living in. And it's the same with feminists. Feminists are separatists. Uyghurs are separatists. LGBTQ separatists. Therefore, they're terrorists. Or we have to control. We have to have really, harsh laws and, police them. And there go your human rights. But it's the economy, stupid. Countries thought that they could benefit from, and they have. I mean, we are meant to be we want world trade, but it is at what cost?
Interesting what you said. It made it sound like the Chinese leadership think that they're the victim here, and they're just defending themselves from all these attacks. So they put the narrative on who's the victim, and it's so typical, isn't it, of abusive
Isn't it?
situations.
Yeah. They're like national men's rights activists. And really, I guess that's, getting at the root of nationalism, really.
If we don't have our prophetic glasses on, it would be so difficult to know what's right because of the information bombardment that we have from all of these different examples that you've given. I think I would have a difficult time. So I'm really grateful that the movement has not only just given us prophetic glasses, but those glasses are kind of focused, which will help us focus on the right issues and how to make choices. It's just a massive, deluge of information out there from your lecture. I mean, it's very interesting, and I thank you for doing it because, I'm learning.
So the hard thing, I hope we can see the threads of our message. So when we think of 1989 World Wide Web, we're talking about information. When we're talking about 2014 in these hacks, we're talking about information. Data is the new, the weapon. It'll be data that, data gets weaponized basically. So, there's if we can take what we understand about our line and the agricultural parable and just see that those threads running through the this history of China. I will at some stage becoming. One of the things I wanted to understand is more about Tiananmen Square, because 1989 has always been about the collapse of the Soviet Union. So what are we meant to learn about Tiananmen Square? There's something about that state terrorism that I'd like to understand. So we're following the threads of human rights abuses, but also of state control. Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments.
Can I please just make one comment, Terrie?
Sure.
So just along the lines of what Brendan was saying, the compare and contrast. I think with the China and LGBTQ, it's not morality, it's a minority. It made me think of the papacy in LGBTQ. It's not morality, it's so much, it's can they have babies? So anyone in a relationship, they have to have babies. So in a way, there's that oppression there too, which comes back to a similar thing.
Yeah, I think though with Catholicism, it's morality. I don't think they fear LGBTQ as a minority. I think I see what you're trying to say. Then minorities, because if we can't have babies, we're going to die out. Yeah, the thing is, this is the problem. Is we know from previous studies that they've got an aging population and a population decrease that is a real problem. And yet, if they just allowed gay marriage and gay adoptions, wouldn't have to have, you know, all those, there'd be plenty of couples that'd be putting up their hand to adopt their children. You know, the solutions to their problems are right there, but they're feared for the wrong reason.
I just want to say thank you. Quite a few things dropped into place for me when you were talking about China entering the World Trade Organization in 2001. How that, you know, the fallout from that reverberated for the next, well, since then, but it directly led
Across
to
the world.
Donald Trump's election. Couple that with, you know, collusion and Russian interference in electing him and all that. But that decision that they made in 2001, well, they had 1989 in Tiananmen Square to help them with that decision. And they chose to still do it. So they've got a major waymark in 1989 to reference their decision in 2001. And they still... We have
nothing to fear for the future. They had nothing to fear for the future. If they remembered, you know, you got to, sorry, Brendan. Remember.
No, you're right. That's right. They knew, they know what's going to happen. Like, surely they would know what's going to happen because it's already happened. It just exacerbates.
I mean, and we also see that, you know, they were Democrats that compromised on some of their core principles. You get to the end of your office and you want to get things done. You know, there was an urgency to get it done. And now they're thinking, well, what was the urgency? Maybe we just should have kept negotiating.
And that led to, well, look what all that has led to. It just created a huge narrative. Plus, it was true. Manufacturing.
And it's interesting. Oh, it's true. Those three economists, I just bring up. Oh yeah, those three economists in the Vox article, it starts off by saying David Autor, there's one of them, believes both these things to be true. One, that Donald Trump's diagnosis of trade with China as a source of woe for countless American workers was both accurate and a crucial part of his appeal on his march to the White House. And two, that Trump's plan to help those workers by cracking down on trade is likely to backfire. So he says they're both true. He was right, but his answers are wrong. So, you know, you can do your own, you know, it just talks about the seismic shocks in towns scattered across the American heartland. Long-lasting effects on the US labor markets. And we read the list of, you know, the social impact. You know, America is not better off. How could they have done things different? I don't know, I'm not an economist or a politician, but we are human rights activists, first and foremost.
Thank you.
All right, well, I better, no worries.
When you finished your lecture, you will be giving us a that chart, wouldn't you, at the end of it, or
Sorry, Josephine?
when you finished
Oh.
finished covering the topic, you will give us that chart, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I can put it on the group now.
Thank
There's
you.
a couple of things that I added LGBTQ. There's a couple of things kind of running out of room, and there'll be another one on the other side when we get to 2021. So yeah, there's a bit more to come. Might be able to finish it off next time.
Terrie, can I say
Yes,
one
Molly.
thing? You know, as we can see with all these major world powers, they are sort of ignoring human rights. And it's sort of, it's the solutions, because we know we're heading towards Sunday law. And it's the solution for all these troubles that the world are facing is equality.
It's a new kingdom. Like Mbaki was sharing this morning,
Yeah.
we need to understand the how God's kingdom operates,
Okay.
because we don't belong to this world in that sense. So there is no real solution in that we offer the only solution there is, and that is to join another kingdom, because the world's on a downward path, spiraling down to catastrophic end. This has set off a chain of events that we saw an event here that got empowered here. There's no going back now. It's headed to Sunday law. So as discussed this morning, if we think of 2014, this is when the world has to wake up and say, well, what's happening now? Then they also have to go back. They need to go back there 10 years, etc. They need to go back in history. We've gone back to 1949. Nothing happens in a bubble. There are threads, but still there are events here that are catalysts for what is coming.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, no worries. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yambaki. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. I'd like to thank our speakers. Oh, you're welcome. That's okay. And next time I'll get somebody else to lead out. You all have a wonderful afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again in a fortnight.